What is up, slackers, and welcome to a very spooky Halloween episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast, and I am your host, Jason Eck. So as I've said on the podcast before, I wouldn't consider myself a horror aficionado per se. I know there are people who are really, really into the genre. I've always been a appreciator, and certainly this time of year is when I watch the most, and really probably one of the few times a year that I do watch horror movies. I watch varying degrees of, I like a good haunted house story, but usually those are, I don't know, for me personally, oftentimes less scary than a really good slasher. When I say a really good slasher, I just mean something, I guess, kind of the classic style with, the jump scares and all those kind of things. There's been a lot in the news lately about a movie called Terrifier 2. I personally have not seen the first Terrorizer because I don't love, and I mentioned this before, the whole torture porn style of horror movie that we got to know in the, early 2000s. Your Hostels, your Saws, save for the first Saw. The first Saw is brilliant. It's just a great movie. I look at it in the same way as so take this as I truly mean it, which is like a 7. Now 7 is a psychological thriller procedural, like it's a cop movie, serial killer movie, and also horrific. I actually think that first Saw had all these elements. It was very much a character study. But the stuff like Hostel, I never needed to see Hostel, to be perfectly honest with you. And I certainly didn't see Hostel 2. It just wasn't appealing. It was, not that Eli Roth isn't a really great filmmaker. It just doesn't appeal to me. It didn't have anything I was looking for in a movie. It was more, just my opinion, it was meant to shock. It was meant to be gruesome and gory and all that. I do understand the subtext of the story, but that's usually not what I'm looking for. So Terrorizer has been, as of late, making people faint, vomit, heart palpitations, fainting, just falling out of their seats in terror and in horror at what they're seeing, right? So all the right words, they're doing everything that you want. And this is within the context of your supernatural slasher film. So I was thinking a lot about the individual different slashers because, with the exception of the granddaddy of them all, which I think is Psycho, I think most would agree with that. That is a fantastic, it's Hitchcock. You really can't beat it. But that really set the stage for the concept, I think, of the slasher. Now, if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. What did I miss? Because I really thought the first one really was Psycho. And I think, if my timeline is correct, the next one would have been Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was late 70s, 78, 79, something like that. So Tobe Hooper. So I was thinking about how the Terrifier movie has a character, Art the Clown, which is taking some classic tropes of horror. The clown. You don't have it without the clown. But just a quick story about it. So my stepdad and I, we both read Stephen King stuff. Stephen King, right? Brilliant. And he had been reading it, and it's a pretty sizable book, right? And a pretty deep story. Time shifts and all that. And I remember being upstairs in my room, and I hear this thud and some kind of sound coming out of him, right? And I think something is really wrong, right? So I run down the stairs, I'm like, is everything okay? And he's like, so spoiler alert for anyone who's unaware of it at this point in 2022. He goes, and I try to keep it clean, but I just gotta say, it's a fucking spider. It does take away the weight and the heft. Now, obviously it's all about your fears and all those kind of things and how it manifests and all that kind of stuff. But he found it incredibly disappointing that you then had this culminating moment with a spider. And if you're not particularly scared of spiders, which many people are, of course, it's a little bit lackluster, right? Because in and of itself, Pennywise is terrifying. However, this Art the Clown takes your It clown scenario and ups the ante to such a level, because basically it's the character itself is in a very, modern, colorful world, but appears to be monochrome, right? Almost black and white, but literally. So more of a mime style. And I always find silence to be very, very scary. The Quiet Place is well known for using silence as a tool. But I go back to an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer called Hush, and the big bad of that episode were the gentlemen. All sound was removed from Sunnydale. Terrifying. Brilliantly done. So I was thinking about how Generation X really is the first generation of the true slasher. Now, obviously, you're going to have some of your, your boomers who were first. You went from your Psycho to your Texas Chainsaw Massacre to your Friday the 13th. However, when you think about our age group, Jason, Freddy, all of those characters were very much a part of our youth. And for some of you, all your teen years, and certainly my teen years as well. So I was thinking about the different motivations. So using Terrifier as this launching point, the character seems to have no other motivation other than carnage and sadism. Now, that's not to say that every serial killer and slasher in these movies, whether they be supernatural or entirely human, there's sadism involved, but they do have different motivations. It's not always just for the sake of the kill. There might be something behind it, because really great horror are psychological studies. So I'm going to go through the first few true slashers and some of the tropes and elements that go into it, and how then there was a shift, my opinion, that is very Generation X. So, of course, talked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Leatherface. What are the motivations? There's family involved. There's the fact that they're cannibalistic. So they're kind of an example of possibly severe mental deformities as well as physical deformities, most likely as a result of inbreeding. And it's certainly more about just the sadism, right? There's not this internal motivation that's predicated on a experience or a situation. Now, I think they do some stuff with prequels and those kind of things. I haven't really delved into too much how they've modified the mythos of the Leatherface, and I'm forgetting the name of the family right now, of his whole clan. It's like, okay, the first one's brilliant. Subsequent ones, I didn't really get into. Although people have told me that the remake, so again, a Gen X remake with Jennifer Biel, right? Jennifer Biel's was Jessica. There's Jennifer Biel, Jessica Biel, whatever. Anyway, I heard it was really, really good and a very faithful homage and remake and reimagining. And of course, in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you got your final girl. And in this particular case, the final girl was Sally Hardesty, who was played by Marilyn Burns. So the concept that this young, strong, and not necessarily a heroine in the way of like Ripley from Aliens or Sarah Connor from Terminator, it's more just surviving. Now, either destroying the bad guy or merely surviving, oftentimes from being saved, in a way, a damsel in distress. But you've had to survive the night or the week or whatever it is. So that was the first real, I think, final girl. So then you have John Carpenter's Halloween. So again, you have a situation that is about family, but also severe mental illness. Why would a 6-year-old Michael Myers murder his sister? Now, there's elements that go into it, who she was, what her character was, right? Oftentimes the people who are killed are indulging into what would, particularly at that time, have been considered immoral behavior. So that was also part of it, right? It was if you act in such a way, there is potentially going to be ramifications, like engaging in premarital sex. It's not just that you might get an STD or pregnant, you might be murdered, right? That was, better watch out what you're doing, young lady. Hey, young man, better watch out. And that became kind of a trope. But with Halloween, you did have Laurie Strode, obviously played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who is the daughter of Janet Leigh, who's in Psycho. Beautiful. So Laurie Strode's the final girl, but also his sibling. So again, it's a family issue born of mental illness. And then, of course, Michael becomes more mythical and, a supernatural element. It's called The Shape by Loomis, right? There's an evil, just a pure evil emanating. Motivation in this particular case, although the family is the target, it's to inflict pain and to kill. So fairly single-minded. So that brings me to my two favorite slashers. And in my opinion, the true classics. Because they're much deeper. Now, they've certainly gone to great lengths. And I haven't watched Halloween Ends. That's my plan for this Halloween week. I am going to watch Halloween Ends. But they've added and subtracted to that story depending on the iteration. You have your, original Carpenter, then you have your Rob Zombie stuff, and now you have like what is considered canon of these last few movies, coming up with some kind of resolution. They fill in backstory, motivations, those kinds of things. So again, if there are more motivations involved with Michael Myers other than just kill Laurie Strode and whoever gets in the way, tell me in the comments. What am I missing about the character study? I'm interested in knowing. So that brings me to Freddy and Jason. Now, obviously they had a movie, Freddy versus Jason, taking these two horror icons and pitting them against each other for kill count. But that movie is, in a way, kind of outside the realm. Now, it's been many years since I've seen it, so maybe I'm talking out of turn. But that also seemed out of character for Jason Voorhees, and I'll explain why. So if you go back to the original Friday the 13th, obviously Jason is not the killer. It is his mom, right? So Mrs. Voorhees, she is the killer. And in her estimation, this is noble vengeance. This is vigilante justice. Because camp counselors, ultimately, even if they're not these camp counselors, anyone associated with Crystal Lake and the camp is immediately guilty in her eyes of either currently or potentially having a situation that she faced, which is her developmentally disabled child being unattended and ultimately drowning because the counselors were off fornicating, right? So that's the basis. To her, she wants to keep the camp closed. She doesn't want any of that, and she wants them to behave themselves, kind of thing. So she thinks that she is the hero of the story. How does it end? You have your final girl on Friday the 13th. Alice survives and decapitates Mrs. Voorhees, who's trying to kill her, by the way. Like she's actively trying to murder her. So, of course, supernatural Jason from beyond the grave, beyond his watery grave, witnesses his mother's gruesome death. So now Jason has additional motivation beyond just getting revenge for those who let him drown and die, but also the same type of person who killed his mom. Jason is a tragic story of a developmentally challenged child who was literally left unattended to die. So he's not based upon, this. They've tried to shoehorn in so many things into his story with supernatural elements. Obviously, he's coming from beyond the grave, but he has a claim, at least, to what he's doing is coming from a place of real emotion or emotional turmoil, and camp counselors who are at the camp behave poorly. Now, that doesn't hold up for the rest of the series, let's be honest. But still, the first inclinations of the character, I'm not saying is noble. I'm not saying that vigilante justice is appropriate. But what I'm saying is, when you juxtapose him to the next guy, at least his motivations are very clear and to some extent understandable. But when you also put it into the context that he is developmentally challenged, you would imagine that he was also emotionally, unstable. That's a recipe for disaster. But again, a tragic character, which is why I think, like all of these, you start to root sometimes for the villain. Jason's an interesting one because of where his villainy stems from. Vengeance is bad, people. Vengeance is bad. I'm just saying from a character study perspective, it's interesting. So that brings us to Freddy. So Freddy Krueger, he's also seeking vengeance. However, he's seeking vengeance on those who sought vengeance against him. Because, of course, Freddy Krueger, when alive, before he became the dream demon that he became, was a serial child rapist / killer. Took him down in the boiler room, killed them. Made that killer glove while human. He was a human monster, if you will. And the justice system wasn't doing the trick. So the parents of the town, gosh, what's the town? It's Elm Street. What's the town? I'll think of it later. Decided to take matters into their own hands, barricade him in, light the place on fire. He dies a horrible, gruesome death. His fire is awful. Okay. So his motivations is seeking vengeance against the children to those who sought vengeance against him, because he didn't think if they're such fine, upstanding people that they would take justice into their own hands. The vigilante justice, the lynch mob, if you will. So when you juxtapose the characters, Freddy is witty, he's funny, he's charismatic, right? Which would have been, I think, part of the MO of someone who's able to lure young people down into his boiler room, right? His motivations from the very beginning have been sadistic. They've been evil. And his whole quest is very different than Jason's. Jason Voorhees was an innocent child who was left to die. Freddy was a terrible child-killing bastard who was the bastard son of 100 lunatics and kind of got what he got coming to him. Again, vengeance and vigilante justice is wrong. I'm just talking about in the films. I feel like you have to qualify everything now, just in case. I'm not advocating for any of this kind of stuff. I'm just saying, when you juxtapose the two characters, one could almost have some claim to, hey, these people did this to me. I was a little boy. I get to get them back. Now, mind you, these are none of the counselors who were here when it happened, so it's all just crazy. It's all bonkers. It's all wrong. But you compare the two characters, their motivations are all completely different. So then they just, as the series goes on, for both of them, they try to get more into different backstories, including, I think, at different points, trying to build sympathy for Freddy. They had, flashbacks to his father, who I believe was played by Alice Cooper, a horrible man, if I remember correctly, and he was abused and all those kind of things. It's one of those additional backstory fuel that probably made sense when Freddy was becoming very popular. Because the one thing that all of these things have in common is that the killers themselves are the stars. So when you think about Batman and Joker, you need to have Joker in a Batman series. And ultimately, the Joker proved to be such a powerfully popular character to get his own film with Joaquin Phoenix. So what's the old phrase that, if you're around long enough, the hero becomes the villain, or the villain becomes the hero, something like that. And I think this is the case with all of these. They became the stars of the franchises. You can't have Friday the 13th. Well, I mean, certainly Halloween has made attempts to have, different iterations of the man behind the mask. Halloween 3 was someone completely different. Obviously, in Friday the 13th, it wasn't always Jason. It was Mrs. Voorhees. But it's always Freddy. It's always Leatherface. And no matter how they try to paint a backstory that somehow humanizes them or gives them some kind of sympathy, I see why it works, because everyone's always rooting for the bad guys. However, there was, in my opinion, just my opinion, all of these films could fall under the Gen X banner. Usually what I mean by that is, I think more the stars or the actors involved in many of these, right? If they were younger, like teens and stuff like that, they're potentially Gen X and not boomers. Now, many of the initial filmmakers, the Tobe Hoopers, the John Carpenters, the Wes Cravens, all those guys are baby boomers. But, a lot of the other actors that were in it were on the cusp. Discounting, obviously, Jamie Lee Curtis, Johnny Depp, they're, boomer actors and all that kind of stuff. And again, I don't say that, as a pejorative necessarily. It's just a reality. But they're very much part of our youth. And, I mentioned in one of the episodes that, I saw some of these movies very, very young. And, it kind of set off a love-hate relationship with horror, but it's still very interesting. Sorry, I'm getting a text here. Okay. So that brings us to truly the moment where one of the directors that I just mentioned came across a script. And the script was from a gentleman who I think is like exactly my age. And that's Kevin Williamson, who had grown up watching all these movies just like we did. And Wes Craven fell in love with it because it pointed out and subverted many of these tropes that I've just mentioned. All the things that happen in a horror movie tend to have specific timing and moments that happen in all of them. From when a jump scare happens to what happens when a group splits up. So all of those things went in to the first Scream. Scream really is, and was at the time, this huge return to form for Wes Craven because it was such a strong script. It has everything you want out of a slasher, including a strong final girl who's more than just final girl. So Sydney, who's the main character, is more leaning towards that Sarah Connors, Ripley kind of hero. Like, she is truly the heroine of the story. She is the one who sets the tone for the good guys. Amazing. Excuse me. But what's great about it is that what they would say out loud, the things that we all know. Hey, don't go off by yourself. You know what happens then. Hey, don't have sex. You know what happens then. Don't do drugs. Don't party. Like, don't do all of these things, because that's when you're going to get got. And to hear it said aloud, knowing everything that we know, like, subsequent times that we would go and see, Friday the 13th part, whatever. And you're screaming like, oh, there he is with the weed whacker, run. Oh, he's going to trip. Oh, he tripped. You knew it was coming. So how do you still make it taut and tense, right? When you know these things are going to happen. That becomes what I think is so skillful about Scream, is the ability to do that. But I mentioned motivation. And that's what's so interesting, is that the killers in this particular case, so again, circumventing the rules. They're playing with the rules. Oh, it was one killer? Now it's two killers. They're both wearing the same mask. That explains how they can seemingly be in two places at once without having supernatural powers per se, because someone like Freddy or Jason, all of a sudden, they're in front of you, but now they're behind you. Well, with Scream, they were able to explain it. They were able to explain it perfectly. And that's what I think is so great. For some reason, while I'm recording, right now, I'm getting 975 texts from junk mail, from family members, just all over the place right now. So I'm going to take this opportunity to go ahead and pull something up on my phone, which is what I was planning on doing in the first place, and pulling up a couple of things here. So what was so interesting is that you had your two killers. You had Stu and you had Billy, right? So Skeet Ulrich and Matthew Lillard, right? And Billy had motivation. To him, he has to get Sydney and her family back for what happened to his family. So a revenge tale. Even though, obviously, Sydney really isn't the one to blame. But she was an easy target. Whereas Stu was just insane. Right? So one has strong motivation, I say that in quotes, and the other's just nuts. Nevertheless, you put those two elements together and you have an amazing killing duo. But the way that it was written, I think the sensibilities of the time then become much more obvious and glaring when you actually go to Scream 2. Because in Scream 2, you have Timothy Oliphant's character, who goes ahead and blames it, or intends to blame it, on media. And this is before, social media was really a thing. This was like, the news sensationalizing things and, making it any kind of story that happens, it gets magnified, sensationalized. It becomes, it becomes mythology. It becomes modern mythology. And that is kind of true. Because if you thought about something that was so insane as one of these stories to actually happen in real life, it would be sensationalized. And I think to a certain extent, it would even be romanticized. So Timothy Oliphant's character is, Mickey Altieri, and Jamie Metcalf, Debbie Salt. Those are your two killers. So again, they also have interesting motivations. One has one that's a revenge, because Debbie is, Billy's mom. And then you have a guy who's just like, hey, I'm just going to blame it on violent games and violent things that I see on TV, because that's a motivation. So what's curious about that is that I think, let's see, so this came out in 1997. Wow, that's amazing. Because we are still, at this point, 2 years away from Columbine. And it's just really fascinating to think about how, in many ways, what we've come to see in the world of teenagers, and it's challenging having teenagers to think about in the back of your head, there is the potentiality for violence in school. And that's why I think we all related so instantly to Scream, is that it wasn't supernatural characters. It wasn't a dream demon. It wasn't this shape that is just a relentless killing machine. It isn't this, kid who is, resurrected from the depths of a lake to commit murder against those who wronged him. No, it's none of that. It's regular people in situations where they decided to take out their frustration on the world and the people around them. But Scream really did kick off, and I think put kind of not a bow on the slasher genre, because obviously it's still thriving today. I just mean there was a certain, I guess, line in the sand that was drawn as far as eras go, right? The era of the slasher had to morph and change because you had such a smart script, and it really did reinvent the genre. Because once you've gone through a couple of Screams and you know the rules of the horror movie and the slasher movie, if you're going to be an inventive director, screenwriter, etc., your game now has to be raised. Like, dialogue needs to be strong, story needs to be strong, motivation, backstory, etc. It was such an artistic feat, and that's what Wes Craven has always done throughout his career. He's always pushed the genre forward. At times, to his detriment and reputation, because he pushed the envelope so hard. So it was just really, like I said, a great return to form. And shortly after that, I think it was maybe 98, I want to say, 98, 97, 98, where he did New Nightmare, which was a reimagining of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, which I thought was really, really well done. I enjoyed that one quite a bit. So then I got to thinking, okay, what are the other Gen X flicks? So there's this great website I stumbled across, and I don't know what exactly it is. It says Letterboxd. I've never been there before. But it gives a list of what is considered Gen X horror. And I think that those of you listening to this are going to go, oh my gosh. Like, particularly if you're not someone who watches horror movies all the time, you're going to go, I remember that. Or, oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. Or some that you might not have heard of. There's a couple in here. I'm like, I don't know. So I haven't gone through the whole list. So, of course, the first thing they have on here is Scream. So just to give a primer of what the article says. A list of movies released between 92 and 2002, which would be considered Gen X horror. Of course, it kicked into gear in late 96 with Scream. Most of these movies, in my opinion, targeted the younger Gen X crowd, who were teens in the 90s. Totally agreed. Most have a teen horror element, but I've included a few, which are simply cool horror movies from the time period. I've only included movies I've seen. Most need a rewatch. Some are bad. Suggestions welcomed. Okay. So these aren't ranked, but the first one on the list is Scream. So Kevin Williamson's script. The next one on here is I Know What You Did Last Summer. What a great cast, by the way. Jennifer Love Hewitt, Freddie Prinze Jr., Sarah Michelle Gellar, Ryan Phillippe. Fantastic. To think that, like, all of us, I say us, are middle-aged and we got kids and, you know, Sarah Michelle Gellar and Freddie Prinze are together. Nice, strong family unit. Wonderful when you think of Hollywood. Freddie Prinze Jr. is a wrestling writer. Just interesting. Nevertheless, that's also Kevin Williamson. Really clever script. Pretty well done, honestly. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much so. So one that I really enjoy. So there's two of them on here that I guess I have to call them guilty pleasures. In part because one of them, there's a song on one of these soundtracks that I just adore. So Disturbing Behavior with Katie Holmes and Jason Marsden? Yeah, James Marsden. I always get him confused. Jason Marsters, who I think was on Buffy, Spike, right? So James Marsden. And there's the song Got You Where I Want You by The Flies, which I just think is such a ridiculously perfect 90s song. I love it. It's on my playlists. It's so good. And Disturbing Behavior was basically the Stepford Wives, but with students in high school and making your kids compliant and making them behave. It's a really fun one, in my opinion. So I mentioned A New Nightmare. That's speaks for itself. Joyride, I never saw that. Never saw it. That's with Paul Walker. But I have no idea. So the other one that is in the same vein, different bad guys, right? But The Faculty. So The Faculty. I mean, this cast, I'm not going to remember everyone's name here, but you have Elijah Wood, Josh Hartnett, Clea Duvall, Jordana Brewster, Usher, Robert Patrick, Famke Johnson, Baby Newworth, Piper Laurie, Salma Hayek, Jon Stewart. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Just a ridiculous cast. And of course, this is directed by Robert Rodriguez, who also directed another one of my favorite horror movies at the time, which was From Dusk Till Dawn, which I've mentioned before, because that was the movie where you're like, holy cow. Yeah, Clooney is a movie star. He's not just a TV guy. That was a great movie. So, Robert Rodriguez, and of course, this involves aliens. Aliens. And aliens were kind of a big thing at this time period as well. In part, I think, Men in Black, the first one's around this time, but you also have, movies like Species, which is on the list, right? So Species, wow, that's 1995. 1995 was Species with Natasha Henstridge. And she was the it girl at this point. Natasha Henstridge, Ben Kingsley, Michael Madsen, Mark Helgenberger, Alfred Molina, Forrest Whitaker, Michelle Williams. I mean, all around this time, it seemed as though you had kind of two directions. Your B-ish horror movies were still getting strong actors, right? Good actors. But I think once Scream hit, it really opened the floodgates of A-list actors wanting to do horror flicks. But Species, that was wicked. But again, aliens. I think the other one that's on here that's aliens, if I remember correctly, I forget. Is Phantoms about an infection? Or was it aliens? I forget. But Phantoms was with Ben Affleck, Peter O'Toole. I mean, seriously? Peter O'Toole. Rose McGowan, Liev Schreiber, also in the Scream series. So again, pretty good cast. Some before they had become massive, massive superstars. But I enjoyed that one as well. So a few others on the list here. Urban Legend. Oh, Final Destination. Okay, tell me, and maybe if you're in a part of the country that you don't see this very often, but certainly in New England, we have logging. We have logging. And you will see trucks stacked with these felled trees out in the back. I won't drive near them. I would rather pull over to the side of the road and let them go miles down than sit behind them or even next to them. I want nothing to do with logging trucks since Final Destination. I mean, honestly, no thank you. No thank you. Oh, awful. But really, really clever. I mean, the conceit of that movie is once you've been marked, right, there's no escape. It's gonna happen. It's gonna get you. And some of them are so sudden, you think you know who's next, and then it doesn't happen, but eventually they get them, and it can come out of the blue, and you're like, oh, are you serious? You got me. What a great, at least the opening one. Oh, that's James Wong. James Wong is an excellent director, so of course that makes perfect sense. He's so good. Honestly, the only one that I think was bad, though, think he did Dragon Ball. No one's successfully done a live action Dragon Ball. Hopefully someday they'll get it right. Of course, then you have all the different Screams, 2, 3, etc. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. Oh, Valentine with David Boreanaz from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He is the killer in that. It's okay. It's okay. Now, a movie that is decidedly bad. I don't want to say bad because it's all subjective, particularly in this genre, particularly if it is self-funded and self-made. So you have Strangeland, which was Dee Snider from Twisted Sister. And he created the script, like he wrote the script. He was starring in the vehicle. And let's see, Amy Smart was in that. Robert Englund was in that. And this was directed by John Peploe. But there's a name that you'll hear repeatedly throughout the horror genre. Captain Howdy. Captain Howdy. Here's the synopsis of Strangeland if you've never seen it. A pierced and tattooed sadist, Captain Howdy, played by Dee Snider, trolls the internet for naive teens, luring them to his home to torture and defile them. When Howdy kidnaps and tortures the daughter of police detective Mike Gage, he is caught. Deemed insane, he is sent to an asylum, but is released soon after, seemingly better. However, Gage knows it is only a matter of time before Howdy strikes again. And he's ready to unleash his own form of retribution when the time comes. Now, this leaves out huge pieces of the puzzle because it's only a synopsis. So there is one thing about the script. So a good script may not necessarily be executed well, right? Like they're two separate things. You can have an amazing script and poor performances, right? But this is one of those things that I think Dee Snider's performance was great, personally. But the thing that's a twist is that he was, for lack of a better term, basically cured. Like he came out of the asylum with the proper medication mix and was a docile, remorseful, kind of quiet person at this point, seemingly rehabilitated. And then there's a sequence of events that occurs that ultimately releases Captain Howdy. But by no means a great movie, but certainly a fun horror flick if you're looking for something to watch during Halloween. So let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see, Idle Hands. That was funny. So Blair Witch, honestly, it is legendary. I don't think I've ever actually seen it. I think I saw the Blair Witch Project 2, which was filmed more conventionally. But the found footage, handheld stuff, it's never really appealed to me, to be honest. I know some people are really into it. I just don't really care for it. Jeepers Creepers with Justin Long, who's had a couple of interesting turns in horror movies. If you've seen Tusk. Wow. Shout out to Kevin Smith, you weirdo. But Jeepers Creepers, that's another like supernatural kind of folk tale, urban legend kind of movie. Let's see. What else here? A bunch of Halloweens. I mentioned before Event Horizon. If you want to rot your brain. I mean, I know it has like, it got like a weird reception at the time, but I mean, some of the images are horrific. And what an amazing cast. So again, you know, Lawrence Fishburne, Sam Neill, Kathleen Quinlan, Jolie Richardson. I mean, Jason Isaacs. It is really, you know, and Paul Paul W.S. Anderson, who I think is kind of best known at this point for all of the Resident Evils and a couple of other things here and there. But I don't know. It's classic. It's legendary, and it's not an easy watch. And it's terrifying because it's also mixing in your science fiction and your supernatural, which isn't always linked together in a really interesting way, because you think very, I think, at least I do, terrestrially when it comes to the supernatural, and you think extraterrestrially when you're out in space. But what if the supernatural, the occult, that kind of thing occurs in space? Terrifying. The Craft, Great Witch story. From Dusk Till Dawn, that's on here. Yeah, they have some things on here that I wouldn't consider horror. I don't consider Blade horror. I consider it action. Ghost in the Machine, not bad. Oh, the Candyman series. Again, motivation of the character. And also the fact that you have to seek out the character. It doesn't just show up. You have to call it. You have to call the Candyman. And his backstory, again, is actually tragic. There's romance, there's love, there's the scourge of slavery in the past. I mean, it's a fascinating study, and one that my wife, who decidedly will tell you she hates horror movies, hates them. Candyman's a brilliant story. Tony Todd, dude, like, good stuff. And anything else of note, the Leprechaun series, if you want to go ahead and see Jennifer Aniston's original face, go see Leprechaun. Anything Bruce Campbell, Sam Raimi or otherwise, Bubba Hotep is on here, ridiculous. Because comedy, there's a place for comedy in horror. Leprechaun leans in between the two. And, yes, these two are about humans, once again, being more terrifying than anything. And that single white female and The Good Son with Macaulay Culkin. Great, great movies in different ways. So this is basically running the gamut. So the stuff that was happening, The Crush is on here too. So like The Crush and Single White Female, like The Crush was a kind of a brutal watch, because you're like, oh my gosh, like this could happen. It has happened. You've had stories like this. I mean, if you think about like actual news, you have Joey Buttafuoco, right? And Amy, oh man, I am going to forget her name. But basically, she was infatuated with this guy who never should have been engaged with a teenage girl, who loses her mind and shoots the guy's wife, Mary Jo, right? Isn't it Mary Jo Buttafuoco? She shoots her point blank range in the face at her own house because she was obsessed with him. So, I mean, that's the whole thing about certain types of horror. I'd much rather the supernatural, over-the-top slasher stuff than some of these things that just hit at like a different level of just humans being the worst possible villains. You know what I mean? Like, these can all happen to people that we know. It's just really scary. Or like when you have kids, when you have like teenagers and you think about some of these things, you go, oh my gosh, more terrifying than anything. But I will say this, as we bring this episode to a close, I have watched a number of different movies, like I said, and, the kids are they've never really craved horror movies until now, as they're getting into their middle teens. We watch like scary stuff, like, kind of like the kids' versions, like your Goosebumps level stuff, right? Some scary movies. But now they're actually starting to be intrigued and interested in seeing actual horror movies. So kind of starting light. You don't jump right into Event Horizon. You know what I mean? You don't jump right into Hellraiser, because that's that's sexual sadomasochism. Like that's a whole crazy other story, which is why they're not like the Cenobites and the Hellraiser stuff isn't even on the list, because that's a whole different thing unto itself. Like Clive Barker stuff is like, I love like the Weave World series, and like all the stuff that he's done is just subversive on a whole nother level that I'm not really prepared for my kids to be seeing. And I'm not having my kids see Hostel anytime soon. So we started off with something relatively benign the other night. We watched, The Haunting, which is one of the many iterations of The Haunting of Hill House. But this is the one with Liam Neeson, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Lily Taylor, and Owen Wilson playing a character named Luke, who literally, when we decided that we were going to watch the movie, I went, wow. Literally the first thing his character says in the movie is, wow. So now it's become kind of a theme in our house. Wow. So that's my little breakdown of what I consider to be Gen X horror, and how it runs quite the wide gamut, but how so again, if you're a 65er of the Gen X sphere, you're going to be in your teens when Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out, right? So it's clear that this is a genre that really blossomed with our generation and really came to the forefront of the box office, including being a almost guarantee. Like if you want to have a guaranteed hit, you make a horror movie, even on a shoestring budget, and you release it around Halloween, you'll have a hit on your hands. Like it's automatic. And if the franchise itself has reached a certain level, you could be on Friday the 13th, 925, and people are still going to go to the theater to watch it. The Saw series continues to just be a juggernaut when they release them. I think the last one was probably like the lowest box office they had, but still almost guaranteed hits. And then certainly there are some directors in the genre that can basically release something anytime and have a hit with it. So it's very much ingrained in our generation. So whether you love them, you hate them, tell me in the comments, tell me on social media, what are your favorite characters, movies? What did I miss? What are the elements that you enjoy about horror? Are you more predisposed to supernatural or the human, the slasher, the alien, whatever it is, technology? I mean, technology has had its place in these movies, certainly in Event Horizon. And originally you go back to Kubrick and 2001: A Space Odyssey, where technology is the bad guy, or Lawnmower Man, which I didn't even mention. So tell me in the comments, tell me by email, tell me on social media. So head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You could email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. So please leave 5-star reviews, like, comment, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.